So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel on multilateralism and global alignments. And I'm going to introduce the gentleman who's very kindly agreed to moderate this panel, Professor Mark Brawley. He received his PhD from UCLA in 1989. He specializes in international political economy with interests that stretch into international security. His sixth book, Political Economy and Grad Strategy, a neoclassical realist view, explores the economic underpinnings of international power. His recent works include To Trade or Not to Trade, The Political Economy of International Exchange, which appeared in the book International Political Economy. His current research examines how the politics of trade shaped crucial elections in Canada and the United States just prior to World War I. So please join me in welcoming Mark Brawley.
Thank you, Will, and I'll just take that also as a moment to thank our panelists for coming and sharing their expertise with us, for Will for organizing this along with his assistants. Some of you may have met them, who have been working very hard for quite a while to put this together. I have to say they did a very good job in putting this particular panel together. I should probably also thank all of you for coming and participating in this conference. Our panelists are an interesting group, both as observers of events that have happened, but also as participants. They're going to be able to address a number of different issue areas, different parts of the world, different, in fact, a very long list of past experiences dealing with a whole range of different issues, so I hope that sets all of you up to ask some interesting questions. Our first speaker will be Okalik, Eegeesiak. I'm not quite sure I got the last bit there correct, but she's currently chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, and if you're not familiar with what that group does, they have a very interesting role to play with the Arctic Council, and the Arctic Council itself is in fact a very fascinating example of a way to deal with some of the problems that are in the theme of this conference. Just to remind you, this, not just the conference, but the theme for this particular panel has to do with multilateralism and global alignments, and the Arctic poses some particularly complex issues for international governance, and the Arctic Council is one of the few places where Indigenous voices actually have an important role to play. I often think of it as a model that could be used perhaps in other settings. So with that, I will pass the microphone over to Okalik.
Thank you. Okay. This is the format, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to start off by reading a little forward to a book called Stories and Tales from Nunavik. That's northern Quebec. I think it's a good lead-in to what I'm going to be presenting. The foreword says, each time you open a newspaper or turn on the TV, there is new information about the Arctic. Politics, threats from the outside world, sovereignty, and of course climate change dominate the atmosphere. Yet there is relatively little information by the people who actually live in the Arctic. I think that's a good lead-in to what I would like to present today, this morning. Stories are often told about Inuit by other people in radio, in television, in the internet, but forums like this, forums like this forum with McGill, we get to tell our own story when these things happen, and I appreciate that. I'd like to thank McGill again and the organizers of this conference for having me to talk about Inuit and ICC. I'd like to thank the good company I had last night for dinner. And the food was good. The dinner was great. The company was better. So I'd like to acknowledge my crowd that was with me at the table. I've been inspired by this conference so far about what you've had to say, but especially yesterday about how Canada and Canadians contribute to developing countries. I was especially happy to hear how Canadians can and should contribute to other Canadians in need. One of the challenges that we have as a developed country and as Inuit and Indigenous peoples is a lot of assistance or funding that is out there is meant for developing countries or developing people in developing countries. And as Canadians, Canadian Inuit, we're not seen as in need in quite the same way. And I want to highlight that. I was born and raised in Okalik on the shores of Frobisher Bay in Nunavut. My community has grown, as has the interest in the Arctic, from a small outpost with no roads to a city with paved roads and traffic jams. Our traffic jams aren't quite like Montreal's traffic jams, but they are traffic jams around 8:30, noon, 1 o'clock, 5 o'clock. So, and in between about 3:30 when school is out. So they're about 15, 20 minutes as opposed to 2 or 3 hours here, I guess, eh? So we're here to talk about multilateralism. Let me begin by saying that Inuit are an international people, multilateral, I guess. As the international chair of the ICC gives voice to more than 160,000 Inuit in Chikaka, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. As such, we engage in a variety of multilateral fora, including the Arctic Council and United Nations. Inuit formally organized in 1977, creating the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, but now the Inuit Circumpolar Council, to deal with issues on environment, economic, and global challenges, which we saw were impacting our communities. Since then, we have dealt with many different governments with different priorities and changing policies, and that was highlighted yesterday as well. We have dealt with many different businesses with differing economic interests. As alluded to yesterday, our issues have remained the same: concern for the environment, wildlife, education, and healthier communities. Basically, social and economic well-being and a vision for the betterment of Inuit and our communities. Our needs are long-term, and our governments are short-term, and that has to be addressed in some kind of way. ICC has been around for 40 years. Our needs have not changed, but how many governments have we dealt with? You know, so we tend to be looked at as a project or projects or pilot programs when our needs are long-term. Eventually, hopefully, that will change. Inuit, one circumpolar people, live in 4 countries, like I said, with 4 very different political realities and relationships with the state. Alaska natives settled land claims, but didn't address hunting and fishing rights. And they're still working on those. In 2009, Greenland Home Rule Government was replaced by self-government. Chikaka, which I still have to educate myself about, has an emerging and always evolving governance relationship with Moscow. And Canada has settled 4 Inuit land claims agreements and is on a renewed partnership with the Liberal government's pledge as articulated by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's mandate letters. Quote, "No relationship is more important to me and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples." Unquote. ICC, the international arm of which I chair, looks forward as to how this will roll out within the Arctic Council, the United Nations, and other forums in terms of international relations with Canada and Inuit as an international people. One of the more important fora, as highlighted when I was introduced, Inuit engage internationally in, is the Arctic Council. The Council is a model which works to combine our collective knowledge and address important Arctic issues. The Council is comprised of the 8 Arctic states, 6 indigenous permanent participants, 12 non-Arctic observer states, 9 intergovernmental and interparliamentary organizations, and 11 non-governmental organizations. Multilateral. The importance of the Arctic Council is that Arctic indigenous peoples, including Inuit, sit at the table with the states. It is said that boundaries between disciplines are largely artificial, and addressing the world's problems requires combining knowledge in new ways. This resonates with me. Boundaries between countries and people are largely artificial, and Inuit are within these boundaries created by other people or governments. And by communicating and listening and learning from each other, by combining our collective knowledge in new ways, we can find solutions to anything. Inuit are part of a broader family of indigenous peoples. Our rights to cultural practices defines us. ICC works under different declarations and position papers that we have developed and available online. And I'll give you one example. Issues of sovereignty and sovereignty rights in the Arctic have become tightly linked to issues of self-determination. Inuit and Arctic states must therefore work closely together and constructively to chart the future of the Arctic. In 2009, Inuit adopted a Circumpolar Inuit Declaration on Sovereignty of the Arctic, which articulates the Inuit vision of Arctic sovereignty. We also use international instruments, such as the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is not a legally binding treaty, but it does represent the dynamic development of international legal norms, and it reflects the commitment of the UN's member states to move in certain directions. The UN describes it as setting an important standard for the treatment of the world's 350 million indigenous peoples. Article 43 of UNDRIP articulates the rights that constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous peoples of the world. As well, last December in Paris, at the UN climate talks, I led a delegation of Inuit leaders and youth to bring our voice to the international table. We worked hard to negotiate for real action, and although the outcome was better than expected, the final agreement is only a global life raft. We used UNDRIP to encourage the inclusion of language on the rights of indigenous peoples. For it to be in the operative paragraphs, we sought such assurance in the core of the agreement, which is legally binding. In the end, the language was only included in both the preamble to the decision document, where it acknowledges the unique and differentiated rights of indigenous peoples. But the language is weak. The language allows for member states to pivot their interpretation on national legislation and not upon international human rights standards and respective obligations under international law. One could still make the argument that the UN Declaration is relevant, but this wording stifles the UN Declaration's direct relevance and creates a barrier for indigenous peoples. As the climate talks concluded, every major news article on the Paris Agreement featured a photo of the Arctic. At the same time, Singapore had convened an Arctic shipping conference where Singapore, China, India, South Korea, and others noted they have an eye on opening routes across the Arctic Ocean due to climate change. It was difficult to simultaneously watch this and see how hard it is for Inuit to make the world understand the Arctic sea ice is our nuna, our home, our right. It's always hard for ICC to see too that when the Arctic is featured, it's always a photograph of the landscape it's always a photograph of the cute little seal. It's always a photograph of the majestic polar bear. Hardly any coverage about Inuit and the fact that we're there. In closing, Inuit are pragmatic. We want to work with others. We are the constant of the Arctic. Inuit feel intuitive and fierce protection for Inuit do not. Work with us for the betterment of the planet. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, which is Kenneth Frankel. Kenneth has a long experience as a corporate lawyer, also experience in dealing with governments and experience in multilateral institutions. He's currently the president of the Canadian Council for Americas, but he comes to that position after having served as the legal advisor to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. He's a practitioner and an observer and a teacher. He does also do some teaching at the University of Ghent, American University, and he's also been a fellow at Dartmouth College in their global governance, I believe, facility. And so I'll pass it over to Kenneth to tell us about a different part of the world, perhaps, and a different range of issues where multilateralism and Canada's role are going to be important in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. Usually in a conference like this, I never lead with the fact that I've been a corporate lawyer for many years. So with your indulgence, we can hold that aspect in abeyance. A bit of what I'm going to talk about is not so much legal, but policy, political policy, foreign policy, and the like. I'd just like to start and thank Mark for moderating this. I would like to thank Will for organizing a very thoughtful conference. We organize conferences quite often, and I know how much work it takes to get something that's not the standard and bring in different voices and different themes. So congratulations. And to Clelia, who hopefully is here, who answered every single logistical question I had leading up to today. So I thank her and the rest of your staff. Thank you. I'd like to start off, I think it's 5 to 7 minutes, I understand. So try and almost bullet points. But I want to start off doing something that I actually have never done before, which is to quote myself. So it's a little bit of a conceit, but if you will indulge, it's actually an op-ed piece I wrote for the Globe and Mail in 2007. And this is before I went to the OAS, which is the political multilateral for all the Americas, the only one that includes Canada and the United States. And when I wrote, and things have changed a bit, circumstances have changed, but it's a bit of the theme of what I'm still thinking about. And what I wrote was, vigorous bilateralism, not multilateralism, should be the cornerstone of Canada's hemispheric activities. Given the economic, social, and political disparities among the region's countries, bilateralism tailored to each situation makes more sense and would be more effective. Canada should remain active multilaterally, but reconsider how best to direct its multilateral activities to get proper bang for its efforts and its expertise. And as the conflicts of the recent Summit of the Americas demonstrates, and you remember that was the Summit of the Americas, that was a fiasco in Argentina that was basically pirated by Nestor Kirchner of Argentina and Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, basically upended the entire summit. As the conflicts in the recent Summit of the Americas demonstrate, competing visions of Latin America complicate multilateral activity. Unless the new U.S. administration re-engages multilaterally in the issues that matter to Latin Americans, Canada will need to redouble its efforts either to find common cause with other like-minded countries or to shift some of its activities to the bilateral portfolio. Well, that was a different era. The concepts I still agree with. It was an era when Chavismo was very, very strong, not just in Venezuela, but had sympathizers throughout the region, which leaders of the other countries all had to factor into when they were considering how to deal with Venezuela and other factions. Internally, it was also a time when George Bush was president of the United States, and multilateralism meant the Iraq War, some ad hoc group to lead the Iraq War. So it really wasn't a great time to be thinking about building great, wonderful multilateral coalitions in the Americas. Now, having said that, let me go back to a few bullet points. I believe very firmly that Latin America is the region in the world where Canada has and can make the most impact and has the most influence, has deep business, social and cultural ties that go back many years. Canadian foreign investment in Latin America is bigger than any other region in the world except for the United States and in Europe, much bigger than in Asia. Multilateralism is indispensable in the hemisphere. Having said what I said at the beginning, I do believe it's indispensable for several major issues. And what are some of the issues confronting the hemisphere now? Illegal drugs, rethinking the drug strategy. And that's not just about drugs, that's about security, migrations. It's a series of issues which are really at the core of many of the problems going on, and not all of the problems for sure, but many of the problems going on. The environment, now that was dealt obviously with in a broader multilateral way at COP21 and what will come after that, but there are also unique environmental issues in this hemisphere that need to be addressed on a hemispheric basis. And obviously public health issues, right? Zika virus, other kinds of things that we all hear about. That's a hard thing to solve on a bilateral basis, and the hemisphere is pleading to have multilateral solutions to those issues. Multilateralism just also doesn't deal with pressing problems, but also provides an opportunity and a platform to talk about and plan about good things that could happen in the future, things that the hemisphere could work on together to avoid problems in the future. Again, I said, but multilateralism is not, in my opinion, a substitute for very strong and vigorous bilateral relationships. Now, I want to get into a couple seconds before my time is up. Canada has challenges in the hemisphere. And we can, maybe in the question and answer period, we can get into what's over the last several years in the previous government's policy towards the Americas and how that may have shifted a perception of Canada in the hemisphere. But let me, holding that in abeyance at the moment, let me list a few issues that I think, the most salient issues that come to mind. One is that there are more players now playing in the hemisphere on an individual and on a multilateral level. The proliferation of multilaterals that operate in the political, quasi-political, quasi-economic arena are many. Canada's only a member of one of them, which is the OAS. So already you have other multilateral players that maybe aren't as effective and aren't properly resourced to do kinds of things that they say in their charter they want to do, but there is some movement in that direction. There's certainly a will amongst a number of the countries to try and fortify those organizations. So that's competition, if you will, to an extent with what's going on, with the one multilateral of which Canada is a member, which is the OAS. Now, it also, on a bilateral basis, there are more countries involved in the Americas now that have interest and have their own resources and leverage that brought to bear when they're trying to influence what goes on in the hemisphere. And I'll just throw out for one statistic. The Chinese finance in Latin America last year was more than the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank combined. That's just one, and that's just continuing a trend. So obviously, when we talked about hemispheric players on a bilateral basis in the a few years ago, we weren't talking about China. We're now talking about China. The new president of Argentina, Macri, was just installed. A very, very interesting political development. Who are the two the heads of state that have gone down there? Hollande of France and Renzi of Italy. They all have interests and they all want to expand their interests. They've had historic interest, but in this global market now, they also look at it as an important country for their business and also to gain a foothold with some more sway. So you have China. I mentioned finance. If anyone who doubts what China likes to do with some of its finance can look at what it did to convince countries in the Caribbean and Central America over the last 10 years to change their allegiance from Taiwan to them. And the methods that they used, often through largesse, to win favor were significant and effective. And of course, we all know about the value of Venezuela's petrodiplomacy throughout the Caribbean and elsewhere. I haven't checked the statistic, but I remember a statistic I used to use that the value of the Venezuelan foreign aid was larger than all the Marshall Plan after World War II in Europe at one point. So we're not talking about insignificant amounts of money. Now, let's talk a little bit about the OAS, which is something I know a little bit about. As I mentioned, it's the only political multilateral in the hemisphere with which Canada is a member, but it's hampered. It's hampered by for a number of circumstances, and one of which is not all of its members actually want it to succeed. And without mentioning specific countries, but there are some countries and big countries that are there just to keep an eye on things, but actually don't really believe that any political organization that unites Latin America should include North America. It's a sort of an add-on that doesn't make sense. Now, part of that is historical because of the way the U.S. had used the OAS through a number of years, which is, everybody knows a little bit about that history, which is not the case anymore. But still, that legacy lives on, and as I say, they're competing organizations that others would rather put their political capital in. Another challenge Canada has, and I guess this goes a little bit to the previous government, is Canada has taken itself out of certain important discussions in the hemisphere. And the fact that the environmental issue is a global issue we understand, it also resonated in Latin America. As one Latin American told me, Canada was an anchor weighing everything down. Now, the steps have been taken already to sort of change that, not just that perception, but that reality, but that was something, an obstacle that had to be overcome. And let me just mention one other point that Canada took itself out of, which was a discussion of drug policy, drug strategy. There was a monumental, no, that's overstating it. There was a benchmark study of sorts that came out of the OAS several years ago. I helped work on that. And it came out of a mandate from the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena in 2012 from President Santos, Colombia, who we all know is a key Colombian ally and quite a statesman in his own right. And he's been saying for years that the whole drug strategy has to be rethought. And you can't do it on a country-by-country basis. It has to be done on a multilateral level for all the reasons, the movement of drugs, et cetera, the transshipment. Now, what came out of that OAS study was the study was an interesting examination of possible ways of thinking through that issue and getting to other conclusions and other solutions. When it came up at the General Assembly for discussion that year, Canada was not interested in engaging in that discussion. In fact, if I remember correctly, even the United States was more interested in a bit more permissive in engaging in that discussion. And you understand how loaded the drug issue is in the United States and the border issues. I mean, that's saying a little bit of something. So Canada has started behind the 8 ball and has cast itself in sort of an obstructionist on certain key issues that are going on in the hemisphere, and that has to be overcome. Another one I'll mention, and I'll finish up, I'm sorry. The concept in Canada that Latin America is just waiting for Canada with open arms because Canada is a kinder and gentler version of the United States, right? That it doesn't have, it doesn't share the unfortunate U.S. historical narrative in Latin America. It is true, Canadian brand is a good brand. As I know people like to talk about the Canadian brand. I know that was a very interesting panel discussion yesterday. It's no question that that's still the case, but it's been bruised a bit, and for all the other issues that I mentioned, it's still there's still obstacles. Even if everybody thought Canada was the savior, there's still other players involved that Canada is competing with, and other obstacles that Canada has to come over. I'm going to talk about Venezuela and the OAS in the question and answer period, because that actually is a bit of ray of hope, and so I'll save the hope part for the discussion part. But let me just say the other issue that the challenge Canada has is there is no country in this world that can say with a straight face that it's right on all the human rights issues, it's right on all the democracy issues, it's right on all those issues that make it the perfect interlocutor for what's going on in the world, in the region, in a bilateral relationship. And Latin Americans certainly understand Canada. They appreciate Canada, but you have a discussion about human rights. Latin Americans have a list of things about Canadian actions or actions on human rights or supporting regimes maybe that are less than pure on human rights record. They know about that. And they also know about democracy. Obviously, everybody respects Canadian democracy, and Canada's been very, very important in promoting democracy in the hemisphere. And I'll leave with this. It's a hell of a challenge. It was for me in 2009, in December, at a Christmas party, to explain to 20 Latin American ambassadors the concept of prorogue. Very interesting concept. When they came to me and wanted me to explain it to me, and basically, as one of them said, so wait a minute, let me understand. If the executive thinks things aren't going his or her way in the legislature, you can shut it down? Well, I said, well, it's not quite like that, but and the response was, if we had done that, there would have been all kinds of resolutions from every now, again, it's done within a constitutional framework, but it just meant to illustrate the fact that it's all a little bit relative, and the hemisphere understands that Canada also has its own interests and its own peculiarities with respect to a number of these issues. I'm sorry I took too long, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. The first thing I have to say is, Ken, I feel your pain because I'm an American who lives in Canada. Every 4 years, people ask me to explain how the primaries work, and right. I would need a week or two to explain, so I feel your pain. Our last speaker is Kathryn White. Kathryn is currently the president and CEO of the United Nations Association Canada, but also she has been serving as the chair of the World Federation of UNAs. So, of course, we are here talking about multilateralism. We're going to talk about the UN. She's going to tell us some things about it. I would also point out, though, that she previously headed up, I believe, a consultancy called Black and White Inc. that did research and policy advice on a whole host of issues, I believe including things like international problems such as climate change and drugs and other similar problems that we look to these international institutions to deal with. So I'm going to underscore the point I made earlier that this is a really great panel because we have people who are practitioners, but also people who have studied these problems from sort of the outside academic view in a way. They've written about them as journalists. They are going to be able to answer lots of different kinds of questions, and I'll pass it to Kathryn before we jump in that direction.
Thank you very much. So thank you to the Institute and to my co-panelists. I have to acknowledge that one of my bosses is here, Francois La Rochelle, who's the president of ACNU Grand Montréal, and I'm happy to see him here as well. Young scholars and global citizens, I'm delighted to be here with you, and to be here at a time where there is grand optimism about multilateralism through the UN with the new government of Canada. And I think the message I'm going to leave you with, and I'm going to race because I'm hoping that you are already aware of some of these issues. I hope I'll bring you some things to chew on. But one of my messages is lowering expectations. And that is because expectations of this new government are so high. There's a moment in a window, but let's see if you agree with me on this. And by the way, I do want to already fight with Mark on whether vigorous bilateralism should somehow be different than vigorous multilateralism. And in fact, I would suggest to you that lots of vigorous bilateralism happens in multilateral settings. Right? In other words, that's where you build friends and relationships. Before October 19th, by the way, I would always refer to the value, and you kind of get that, of the UN as, we're a trading nation. A trading nation needs friends. And where do you find friends but in institutions and organizations where you have many people at the table? So I think the arguments can be made, whoever the government of the day is. So UNA Canada has a mandate, and I think it's probably useful for you to know. Actually, I also wanted to say I'm sorry for any Habs fans. I did read about Carey Price today. We've got a membership of 20,000 Canadians across the country who never lost interest and commitment for the last decade in support for the United Nations. I might say that UNA Canada, with its mandate to educate and engage Canadians on the UN and international issues that we're all engaged in, continue to grow. And interestingly, you might not be surprised by this, but Quebecers are amongst the strongest supporters of the UN in the country. So an interesting place on that, and you know that one of your colleagues is soon to be the new permanent rep to the UN in New York. So some of the questions that come forward at this time is we were posed this question about does Canada play well with others? And I would suggest to you in the recent past we haven't been so strong at that, even in a multilateral setting, sort of eroding the kind of social capital that a country can get there instead of building it. However, this is clearly a moment of great optimism. And I think you probably heard, as I did with excitement yesterday, that the Prime Minister has made it clear that we will run for a seat on the Security Council without any commitments of when. I'm going to also throw it out there to you that my own advice would be sooner rather than later when this social capital and excitement is high. In other words, we're in this place of friend building. And this, of course, is very much on our agenda and our advice. I think that when we talk about how any country, including Canada, works at the UN, self-interest is obviously key. Keynes, of course, talked about enlightened self-interest, and I hope we're a country that focuses a little bit on both. But what I would like to suggest to you that our opportunity now is to put forward in a disciplined way our strategic interests through the UN, and our government has signaled, today you may know is the 100 days of the new government, the expectations of the issues that they want to put forward. You may know, I mean, you've heard climate change is also a big, a foundational part of that. And interestingly, for any political scientists in the room, I will tell you that UNA Canada has been actively engaged on accelerating action on climate change. What we simply did is dealt with the reality that we had, which was with the provinces and territories. So our partnership was through the provinces and territories who, in fact, wanted to take action, allowed their senior bureaucrats to say climate change and to work on them. And of course, it creates a real sense of readiness to now work with the federal government who's ready to jump on board. But I think it's useful. I don't know whether we're all aware all the time about what a disciplined civil society organization can do as we work through other challenges on the federal side, as we've heard from how our government under the past regime was working. I think one of the other challenges about getting Canada into the UN with this new optimism is to make sure that we do it throughout the system. So this isn't simply to say that we're going to compete or put throw our hat in the ring for a seat on the Security Council. But I'd say to you, we need more senior representatives of the Secretary General or SRSGs leading peacekeeping missions. We need more through all of the system. I want to use a bureaucratic term, but from the P level up to the decision maker at the D level in the UN system, and that means a government interested in this. And we had a government formerly that not only was not interested, but actively moved away from that engagement. And I'm happy to hear sounds that some of you may have heard as well, the reinstating of what's called the Junior Professional Officer Program. Close to the clap, and you didn't hear it from me, of course, but this is a significant deal. UNA Canada, by the way, hosts the largest, again, a very successful internship program through UN agencies. Again, a government that didn't like to send folks to the UN, so we just changed the program, funded by the private sector and others, and just made it work because we have thousands of young Canadians who want to deploy and ought to be deploying in these places. By the way, stand by to hear more about our Canada Green Corps, where we will be scaling up both for domestic young people and internationally to look at and underemployed youth, climate change, lack of productivity and innovation, linking these opportunities and development together. And I think, again, we've got a moment for this. So I think that the other big issue, of course, is integrating the Sustainable Development Goals, which I suspect in this room I don't have to explain too much. This new series of goals, people complain that there's 17 and they don't quite fit on a T-shirt. I hope more than just defending the fact that it is important that all governments feel that they have a stake in those 17, as well as the, yes, 169 targets, but it is also the globe saying we want to be able to measure that. UNA Canada is once again working at the subnational level, now in partnership with the federal government, helping governments understand institutionally how they integrate the SDGs in basically everything they do. And of course, we're even working together, and Francois, you'll hear more about this, and how we do that within NGOs as well. You know that with the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global North has to report as well as the Global South, so we have some obligations here. Youth was always important to talk about when I'm at a university, but the other piece that you're going to hear the government talk about a lot, and we have a knowledgeable colleague in Jill Sturck in the room as well, is about Canada's diversity advantage, what it looks like in Canada and what it might look like internationally, how we scale it up. So I am happy to tell you that UNA Canada has the largest anti-racism program or diversity program in the country for over a dozen years, through some challenging times when we weren't investing in diversity. And I'll tell you, our lesson is we must invest. It's great to say we've attained it. You must invest in it. I will tell you that I have stories from my mother with my complexion telling me about moving to Canada and seeing signs that said, jobs for hire, no Irish need to apply. When the economy's tight, we're always looking at whatever the other is. And then you've heard stories about German Canadians or Vietnamese Canadians talking about the problems that they had in the generational shift. This is something, again, we should be so proud of and taking to the world and sharing with each other, but not forgetting racism exists in Canada, and we must continue to address it. And I will tell you, having spoken to leaders in the UN, including the Secretary General, who I am very pleased, for anybody following my Twitter account, to say that the Prime Minister took a picture of the Secretary General, the three of us, with the Secretary General telling him how important, and again, I'm saying this to my boss, Francois, UNA Canada is to the UN and to his mandate, including in a very disciplined way during the last regime, if I can say, in a respectful and disciplined way. And with that, I think I've touched on those key issues. I hope you're as excited as I am, but let us say reasonable expectations and excitement about how Canadians and the Government of Canada can be engaged with multilateralism through the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you. So now is the time when you, who all paid to come and hear these speakers, you get a chance to engage with them through questions. So you can come up to the mics now and pose your questions. I'm just going to give you the couple of reminders. The one that I think is probably unnecessary from what I saw earlier. Please keep comments and questions civil and respectful. And the harder part, of course, please make your questions rather than comments or essays of your own. So people who have questions, if you could please come up. I'm more than happy to throw some things out to start, just because I do note Kathryn did say she was going to have an argument with me over vigorous bilateralism. She's going to have it with Ken. But I do want to just point out something, because as a professor who teaches on some of these subjects, we often hear the word multilateralism, and I think what people hear is institutional, that it's in an institutional setting. And multilateralism and institutionalism, as far as for me, they're not quite the same things. And one of the interesting points about these three speakers, one of the things that's varied about them, is the institutional settings that they are working in are all very different. I mean, I think of the Arctic Council, as I said, as this really different sort of setting with different kinds of participants, very different from the UN in some respects. And the OAS is one of these bodies that, in fact, is very understudied by political scientists, that has its own set of very broad agenda to deal with and a very diverse array of states. But so I don't know if we should take some questions from someone other than me, though, since I'm always around at McGill. So.
Thanks very much. Once again, my name is Sharon Jeet Parmer. I'm an international human rights law lawyer. I had a question for Kathryn and one for Kenneth. So the UN Security Council report, an NGO that reports on the Council, came out with their report for 2015, and they found two things. Number one, there was extremely high activity at the Council over 2015, but unfortunately very low rates of consensus. And at the same time, they found an actual decrease in public consultations and meetings, and at a time when I think we could do a lot more of that. So my question for you, Kathryn, is what role do you think Canada can play given the realities and the incredible challenges at the UNS, at the Council level? And in particular, how can we play a role in breaking some of this deadlock? And I had a question for Kenneth, and I've been very intrigued by, you mentioned that Canada had been obstructionist on certain issues, and if possible, could you elaborate on in what way we've been obstructionist? And I'm very curious whether the performance of Canadian mining companies in Latin America, particularly on environmental and human rights issues, how that's impacted the ability of Canada to wield whatever influence we might have at the regional level. Thanks.
Take more questions first.
No, I think she's given you guys some things to. Okay,
I'm happy to do that. Sharon, thank you very much for that question. The reality is, and we know this, that the Security Council is an imperfect body. And I might say that when what I talk about what UNA Canada is, we're not blind cheerleaders of the organization, right? We're supporters of it being the most effective organization it can be. I will put to you that I wouldn't be in this job if I didn't believe that jaw was better than bang bang. So that dialogue at the Security Council, and of course it's why it's important to me that we're at that table, is important whatever comes out of it. In terms of broader consultation, you can imagine we are a civil society organization and part of a global civil society organization pushing on this. And I think in some ways you've put forward a really important competitive advantage that we can be taking forward. And that means you also have to make it clear that you want your government to do that as well. I will certainly take it on board now that you've raised it. But I think that it's key that we don't get so cynical that somehow or other everything stops in the Security Council. there does continue to be action. And again, it's all of our responsibility to be part of that. Thanks for the question.
Go ahead, Ken.
Okay. Obstructionism. Did I actually use the word obstructionism? Did I say that yet? Really? Okay.
You were just
okay.
thinking.
Yeah.
I wrote it down.
Yeah. See, you know, I spent all my years in sort of 5 years in the diplomatic world. I usually soften things up a little bit, but well,
You may have said it as someone else's characterization of what Canada was doing.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank you. Well, fine. We'll stay with that word. I mentioned the drug. First, let me say, there are a number of good things that Canada has been doing in the Americas. There's a number of good things that the previous government was doing in the Americas. And so the question was how broad the activity was in the last government. And a lot of people saw it as being much more of a narrowly focused. And with that said, there were still plenty of social assistance going on, different kinds of aid programs and the like. But you know, there are. So it wasn't like the government withdrew from the hemisphere. So I don't want to imply that was the case. But the one glaring one on the obstructionist, or I would say is sort of dragging its feet, maybe is another way of saying it, was on the reexamination of the whole hemispheric drugs situation. And that one, and also was a bit, came to light a little bit with the General Assembly of the Organization of American States in 2013, I believe, in Guatemala City, when the resolutions are going back and forth. So that would be one example. There was some criticism in some quarters that Canada actually was less than cooperative, the government, on the Inter-American Human Rights Commission study on the disappearance and murder of Indigenous women in British Columbia, of which there's been reports on that. So those are two things that I would mention. But you also asked about the mining issues, and the mining issues do come up in the discussions, and they are sometimes fairly and unfairly. And there's a long discussion about mining practices in general in Latin America and Canadian mining practices as well. And so form's probably too little bit long to get into, but it'd be naive to say that those don't come up in a context of human rights or how the Canadian government is policing or not policing its mining companies. What I can say is certainly we have several stakeholders who are large mining companies, and they're the leaders in a project right now, ongoing project. They recognize this issue in a project to deal fundamentally with those issues, understanding that there is substance and form underlying those claims. And I'm not as engaged in that, but I do know that that's going on, and in the next number of months, I think we'll start, hopefully see some things coming out of that. So there is that acknowledgement and action.
Thank you. I have a question.
Yeah, my name is Kyle Matthews. I work at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, and I'm a former UN JPO sponsored by the Canadian government. Did I hear you correctly, Kathryn, that the JPO program is going to be reestablished again, or is that in discussion?
I don't think you heard that from me.
Okay. Didn't hear from
There's certainly a strong indication that that
Okay,
is so.
and would you also know, is there going to be, because there was also the JPO program, but there's also the youth employment strategy that allowed a lot of young Canadian graduates
And
to
we're
go
in discussion with them. I am hopeful on that front too.
Good to know.
Okay, back to this.
I'm Rob Steiner from the Monk School. Sorry, I'll stand back. I'm Rob Steiner from the Monk School at the University of Toronto. I want to actually pick up on your point, Mark, about how we so easily identify multilateralism with institutions, and put a question. It seems that whenever there's a hot topic, there is sort of informal and, to use a business term, disruptive multilateralism that then comes up on the side. So one thinks of 2008, suddenly the G20 existed. It wasn't going through the established channels, except to the degree that the BIS was involved in Switzerland. But it certainly wasn't going through any of the kind of economic fora at the United Nations, to my knowledge. And then I hear the story about, at COP20, there's the Arctic Council, and then there's an improv meeting of non-Arctic nations about Arctic transshipment. And so I'm wondering to what degree informal multilateralism or disruptive multilateralism or issue-specific multilateralism that comes without really much of a secretariat or an institutional base or established ambassadors, does that conflict with the institutions you're talking about, OAS, UN, Arctic Council, or does it complement them? Are the established institutions, do they feel under siege around these issues, or do they feel like they can somehow, is this helpful or is it disruptive? Or maybe disruptive is helpful?
All three of you can answer that.
Well,
You can come write exam questions for me sometime if you want, because that was a
I'm doing
that
that
was
for
a
myself,
toughie.
thank you.
That's an excellent question. In fact, you saw me. So first of all, forgive me. I took your picture so I could tweet. But I'm going to show off my wallet. It's UN blue, as you can see. And if you were up closer, you would see that it's got the UN logo. Probably not expensively made. I want to say that as well. But a gift from the Secretary General. When UNA Canada worked, when Canada hosted the G8 and G20, co-hosted it with Korea to ensure that the Secretary General was fully involved in both of those conferences with a Sherpa. I think you're right that there's an upsurge. We think that there's an issue that must be dealt with. The G20, I always had worries because, of course, it was always the privileged and the wealthiest countries. And my interest, and I think the interest of our organization, was saying, what about the other 173 in the poorest parts of the world? However, in principle, I think we need to let many flowers blossom. It's a challenge in terms of the professional diplomats in the room because, of course, we also have to monitor these things to make sure that there aren't conversations taking place that are, you use the term disruptive, and of course we're seeing this as a positive thing in the business cycle, but disruptive in a negative sense. And those of you who know the challenges of the G78 and so on in the UN system, are these simply workarounds? And that can be a challenge. So in principle, colloques of various descriptions are a good thing. Tying them in or making sure that they're not exclusionary, I think is important.
Go ahead, either one of you, because I definitely would like to hear Okalik talk about this, but Ken, you can say something if you want.
No, you go ahead.
That's a great question. That's a really good question. Talk about it in the hemispheric context. I would say it generally can aid effective action. And part of it depends on how effective a multilateral is or how adroit it is in handling and responding quickly to something. For example, when there were problems in Paraguay a few years ago, Brazil considered that to be a sphere of influence and basically mediated and jumped in and did it. And other people sort of were supporting it in multilateral, OAS and others were supporting, but at the end of the day, a situation where it was considered to be, Brazil just jumped in and took care of it, when theoretically it was a cross-border issue. Having said that, Brazil also jumped into the Honduras situation, the coup or the disruption of constitutional order, and I don't think anybody, including the Itamaraty, the Brazilian Foreign Ministry, would think that they handled that very well. In fact, but for the very agile efforts of the U.S. ambassador in Honduras, things could have gotten a lot worse. So ad hoc peacekeeping across borders or conciliation across borders has pros and cons. What I will say in the context of Venezuela, and this goes back to something I had mentioned in my previous comments, there's been for a number of years, growing precipitously over the last several years, a breakdown in democratic order and liberal democracy as we understand it in Venezuela. And there's nobody in the region who doesn't really understand that. But the OAS could never get a consensus to do something about it. And the leader of the OAS was not raising it as something he wanted to do. That's changed a little bit, no. And it's changed in a very, very interesting way. So even though you still have some countries at the OAS who would be very supportive publicly of Venezuela, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Bolivia, for example. The OAS, the Secretary General has decided enough is enough. It's my responsibility. I need to say something. Now, it's also easier for him to do it now because Venezuela is in such a horrendous economic and political death spiral right now that it's hard to hide from it. And when they sentenced the dissenter to Leopoldo Lopez to 14 years in prison, that was sort of the last straw for a number of the countries. Then it was time that they could speak up. But that was something that it could come about only because the Secretary General, acting in a multilateral situation, could do. And what's interesting about this, and it's a little bit of a constraint on Canada and other countries, is for a long period of time at the General Assembly and elsewhere in OAS, Canada, as other countries, was very vocal about it's the breach of human rights issues in Venezuela, as well it should. And because of it, the ambassadors, incurred the same enmity that others have. It was a little bit akin to being on Nixon's enemies list. If you weren't berated publicly by the head of Venezuela, the president, or major figures in Venezuela, then you weren't doing your job properly, right? So, but that's acting multilaterally. And the fact of the matter is no country could have stepped in and done it unilaterally. And you had Felipe Gonzalez, even from Spain, who's done it, had some effect. But what really had some effect in the last elections in Venezuela was in a multilateral context. And in fact, it was the idea that singular players withdrew from it, and there was a void there, actually gave the political space for Secretary General of the OAS to act. If, for example, that's sort of one of the untold stories, ongoing stories of Venezuela, if President Obama had acceded to some of the most violent or vocal critics on Capitol Hill to do everything against Venezuela short of declaring nuclear war, then all he would have succeeded is putting the United States right in the middle of the Venezuela situation, and that void would have been occupied by the United States, and no Secretary General is going to go in and look like he's on the same side of the United States doing it. So sometimes it's important to let multilateralism work and actively pull back from it in its most sort of vocal forms. Long-winded answer, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, with regards to the Arctic Council and the way it's seen as a model, it's a great model to follow. But the permanent participants like Inuit, ICC, are funded meeting to meeting when it benefits the other party. We are not resourced to do our own research. We are not resourced to do our work on our own priorities. And we are not resourced to address our community needs, infrastructure, housing, mental health, all the challenges that we have. I'd like to add on, yesterday when Tony Clement was talking, I felt like he was very narrow-minded to say that, I'll just preface, I think we all have a role to play in policy making. And he says he's not a policy maker anymore, even though he's an MP. Like, how is that? Like, that's a very narrow definition of what he's supposed to be doing, I believe, for Canadians, not just for his writing, but for Canadians. Inuit or Indigenous peoples tend to be overlooked unless it benefits the other party. We tend to be an afterthought unless like being resourced meeting to meeting, meeting for meeting. The last government really invested in resource development as opposed to investing in social development or economic development for the communities. So they were narrow-minded, in their definition of development, not really developing for the people. Even though that was the, what is it? Development for the people of the North under the Arctic Council. Yeah. So we tended to look at the Canadian government, the last Canadian government, as very resource development oriented, when Inuit are renewable resource development peoples. Yeah. So I like to highlight that too, where other peoples or actors or famous people like to limit the way we want to live, the way we live, the way we have lived, in terms of don't wear fur when it's a renewable resource. Avoid cultural genocide, right? I just want to pitch that in. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Gautam Krishnaraj. I'm a student of microbiology and immunology here at McGill. I wanted to thank the panelists for their comments. I represent the international relations students at McGill University. We just returned from the Commission for Social Development last week, where we were greeted with enthusiasm to hear a youth voice in this forum, which was awesome for us, and we got to engage in a lot of very interesting conversations. And so most of the conversation was surrounding the SDGs, and one of the ones that we found to be the most exciting was Goal 17, fostering global partnerships. So my question was directed to Kathryn White in asking, how do you think that Canada, using its legacy and current status as a soft power nation, can kind of guide these conversations and the Goal 17 partnerships, particularly in the high-level political forum towards the 2030 Agenda and CSOC-D in the future?
Why don't you tell me what you think the answer to that question is, and I'll take notes.
I think it would be interesting. I think, especially with our new government, it's an exciting time, and like you said, it's hard to not have too many expectations of them. But we met with the permanent mission, and they said things change slowly in terms of how they get to act and how they interact with other nations. And I think it would be best if we acted quickly as possible. So.
Well, I'm going to look for you to talk to me, but I will tell you, last night at the state dinner for the Secretary General, the Prime Minister said that he was going to tell his youth minister, and he said, oh wait, I am my youth minister, that we have to act on youth. So this is a moment. And I think that we have to have a discussion. I don't know where Kyle went, but you know, we have to bring these young voices forward to say this is a disciplined way that we can be involved. And of course, we all know the cycle of students, especially the profs, that 2 years you're in the workforce and worried about something else. But increasingly, that and underemployment, the idea of saying this is true in the global north as it is in the global south, I think there are opportunities there. So the question, important, written down in my notes.
And in a similar vein, I know you mentioned or you didn't mention that the JPL program is returning. Has there been any talk of Canada having a youth delegate again? Because it's been almost 10 or 12 years since we've had a representative, and that's another program that I think we can have a very strong position and voice in.
Well, you know that we're taking that forward too.
Thank you.
Could we have the next question over here?
So my name is Caitlin Bowman. I'm also part of the International Relations Students Association at McGill. In light of what was discussed actually in the previous panel with a group of young people, we brought the idea of climate change was brought up a lot. However, there was no real concrete discussion as far as where it went. And I think part of that was the panel's openly saying that they weren't an expert on that. My question to the panel here is, as a young person and moving forward, how can I individually and how can other young people take concrete actions towards what's addressed and addressing climate change, and not just wait for someone to tell me what to do?
Good question.
Is that looking like it's a pitch to, and I have to say, you must call me Kate. I only am called Kathryn when somebody's mad at me, by and large. So, sustainable consumption. You can think about what you're purchasing. You can think about your actions. I say to people that global citizens have never been on a transportation bus or subway. You don't have to be flying around the world to be aware of the world. It's small. With our social media, we can connect in that way. I also want to say, as I work to level this up, to ladder it up, by the way, we used to say escalate. And now on Bay Street, we say ladder up. I'm sure my monk school knows this as well. But this change that we're proposing in the Canada Green Corps is really to spend some serious time in doing that technical training, because of course that's also what the SDGs tell us, is that you come out of university with all sorts of great analytical skills, but not necessarily employable. So some of that is in, again, the public domain about how do we measure emissions from a building so that you might even be able to calculate in your apartment. I mean, imagine if every youth, if you communicated that to all of the youth in Canada and we were able to take it to the global south in some way, right? You think about your life. I mean, we talk about the sharing economy. Terrible thing to mention Uber in Montreal today. And I'm not sure that that's really what the sharing economy is about, but that's certainly a way, whether it's textbooks, again, sorry to textbook, printing companies and so on, but it really is those everyday decisions in your life where you're conscious of what it is that you're doing and that you're talking to your colleagues and your friends about this. I think that those are important first acts as well. And thank you. You lift me by asking the question.
I just want to add, I don't want to negate anything that Kate just said, and I'm the one that's been calling you Kathryn because
that's great.
Being formal, but it's also not wrong to expect your political leaders to be addressing this through policy. I mean, I think that echoes what Okalik was just saying about what the speech I did not hear that Tony Clement gave, but that anyone who's in Parliament should be engaged in terms of policy making, and it's up to people as voters to also be expressing this as a demand that their government serve that purpose.
I'm going to jump in a little bit here to say that
it's both, right?
I think it is both. The thing is, for young people, they may feel quite removed from that, and your everyday action, and it can have ripple effects as well. I mean, obviously, that's why I think I'm in the room, to note what you're telling and taking that voice up. But it is both, and it's recognizing that you can do it independently and also as part of global citizenship.
I'd just like to answer that as well. From the Inuit perspective, where we have the highest birth rates, the highest suicide rates, real high cost of living, no infrastructure. We tell our Inuit youth, get educated. Get educated, get educated. That's how you'll be involved, and that's how you'll contribute to the community.
Good. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentations. My name's Ann Dadson. I'm with the McGill Institute. My question really is for all three of you, but particularly to Okalik. I was very struck by the comment you just made about the resources with which you don't have to work. And so I'm wondering what multilateral initiatives or organizations, informal or formal, you have found in your collective experience have been the most effective in drawing to a larger public concern the issues of Indigenous peoples?
I think when we're empowered, when Inuit are empowered from the community level up, when we work on our own priorities, up until the last government, the Liberal government of the time, I shouldn't say the Liberal government of the time, but the government of the time, because we work with different governments and because we have to. The government of the time financed and resourced and supported Inuit communities around climate change. And then that all stopped for 10 years. and tended to look at it a little more holistically than other governments. So when Inuit are empowered to lead community work, territorial work or national work, and base our decisions, base your decisions, base government decisions on Inuit consultation, Inuit input, Inuit perspective. And it's taken a long time, and it will take a long time, but we're always educating people about where we're coming from, what we want to do. I don't know if I answered the question, but
I guess I was really interested in multilateral organizations, international fora or initiatives where you have found those voices have been heard most effectively. I don't know whether how that applies to the UN Association or to the Organization of the Americas.
maybe I'll expand on that a little bit around the Arctic Council again, where the chairmanship changes every 2 years, which is another problem. But the last chair, the Canadian government, funded research into traditional languages and how we do for around traditional languages in different countries, and talked about best practices. We talk on and on and on about best practices, but the best practices are never taken the next step. We're not financed to do the good work that is being talked about, or that could be built upon in other countries or in other classrooms, in other fora. So, yeah, you're right. Like, build on what works from the community, yeah, as opposed to announcing new projects because you're a new government or because you're a new chair. Build on what works.
Can I take one last question over here?
Hi, my question is more specifically for Kenneth Frankel. So I'm an undergraduate economics student here at McGill, and I'm originally from Colombia. And I'm very familiar with the drug trade and all its negative consequences. You spoke a lot about how Canada dragged its feet in the past. I was actually wondering if you had any insight on Canadian policies in the future, and if it involved more cooperation with South American and actually American nations in general, or if you were doing more work at home, because it's true that we feel the problem is not only in South America or where like production is, but its demand is generated in North America and in Europe mostly. So is there any, do you have any insights on what is going on with that? Thank you.
Well, congratulations from coming from Colombia. Wonderful, wonderful country. Deep family roots there. I'll know the answer to your question maybe in a couple months' time. And we're actually doing we have an initiative going on in that direction. The issues I know we have raised with the government at various levels. But as we know, this government came into power a short while ago with a very full plate. And I think they're trying to sort of deal with sort of a bit of triage at this moment and try and shore up most critical relations that they think have faltered or have been allowed to wither, need to be strengthened. My guess is that will be something that will be dealt with. They'll take a serious look at it and want to engage. How quickly, I don't know the answer to that. But we will, it's something that we are working on.
Thank you. Are you going to tell us all? Well, first we should thank our panelists, most definitely thank our panelists for giving us some interesting ideas. I think there's a number of questions that we need some deeper answers to, but we can do that, I believe, over lunch.
And what better time to do it? Well, you stole my punchline. Lunch. Thanks, Mark. Thank you for chairing.